And we are back. All right, so now we're going to look at another weapon that was used in the offhand during the period, not necessarily with a cutlass, but I'm talking about cutlasses today, so I'm just going to kind of extrapolate. Cool. And Patrick just pointed out for the previous thing, the Bligh Rebellion and the Rum Rebellion were about 10 years apart. And he put the dates up in the chat, but it went away before I could read them out. But yeah, do look that up, because if you're not Australian, it's kind of cool to learn about some Australian history, because we don't get much love in the rest of the world, in terms of our history. And if you are Australian, look it up as well, because there's not enough love for Australian history in Australia. And Australian history is a lot more interesting than what you would have learned in school, which I swear is actually a conspiracy to bore the average Australian out of being interested in history. Anyway, we're going to look at what to do if you've got a carbine in the offhand, or like maybe not a rifle, because period rifles were long enough for a bayonet, but basically a shorter gun. So this is actually a training bayonet that is meant to be about the length of I think an M16 with bayonet, but it is also conveniently about the length of a period carbine, which was not an uncommon weapon. I have seen carbines in naval museums, so I assume at least some of them were aboard ships. And certainly, if you were going to take a firearm aboard a ship, having a slightly shorter one would have been useful. But otherwise, carbines were used by certain cavalry regiments, particularly dragoons. They're also used by what were termed frontiersmen. People whose people who were maybe had duties other than just being in the firing line, or alternatively were in dense scrub and terrain and moving about, so needed a shorter weapon. But yeah, a problem with the carbine is if you stick a bayonet on the end of it, so if you imagine like a little, a point on the end, it's still so much shorter than, a musket with bayonet, and it's even short enough that it doesn't have as many of the doesn't have a lot of the advantages that musket and bayonet has against a sword. So it's not uncommon for, it's really not uncommon for units who had carbines to also have swords. I mean, obviously, cavalry also had swords because, you would occasionally, like dragoons would occasionally, be needed to charge enemy flanks, or, harass and cut down fleeing enemies. But also like frontiersmen would have basically a cutlass, or referred to as a hanger, with a sawback blade. So it actually had a saw on the back of the blade, which is kind of cool and also kind of terrifying. But yeah, so say you've got a carbine, you've fired your carbine and you still want to get some use out of it, you can put it in your offhand. And this was a thing that was done, particularly North American Ranger units would do this, where they'd have a carbine in one hand and either a Bowie knife or tomahawk in the other, and they'd use it as a parrying device. So generally, I find just having it here in pretty much the same hand position you've had for boxing or for a parrying dagger, just sit it just nice and next to your elbow. And then all you do is you just basically push it out, sort of arc. If you can see that I'm arcing my hand around the line. Obviously, if there's an attack coming in that I'm very confident of, I'm going to punch to try and catch the attack somewhere. But I can cover an incredible amount of space with this. And I mean, this one is just hickory, so it's reasonably light. But the actual carbines are quite heavy. Like when I did colonial era reenactment, I got to handle some, and yeah, they're quite heavy, quite solid. So punching one out will give you a lot of authority in stopping an attack. I would not hold it out like this, or at least not without putting my sword in front of my hand. But yeah, if you hold it out, your hand's going to get hit. You're probably just a quick crack to your hand, or even a thrust. I would actually hold it back, and then anything that comes in on this side, I just punch out, probably with a step forward, because I really don't need to worry about being undercut. My opponent's going to have to get really quite far down to undercut me, which means that there's a lot less risk of stepping forward, which also makes my throwing a countercut a lot easier. And because I've got this pushing forward to displace my opponent's sword, their sword is going to be moved backwards as I come in, which gives me an opening to come in with my own sword. So from this position, all I do with the carbine is punch forward with both weapons. Punch forward with both weapons. Punch forward with both weapons. And with this, I find even just having being slightly more squared up to get more impetus into the carbine punch can be really, really good. So punch forward with both weapons. Punch forward with both weapons. Punch forward with both weapons. And punch forward with both weapons. So this is kind of like, as a method, it's kind of a useful thing because it gives you kind of this one defensive trick, but you can also do that kind of forward punch offensively. So I can minimize risk to my hand by keeping my hand moving. As I come in, I can throw my sword on basically an absence. I punch forward. I can even bring my hands together to really kind of clear and just have this really kind of heavy tangle of swords and carbines and just objects everywhere. It's like bang, come in really aggressive. Really aggressive. Really aggressive. And really aggressive. So yeah, so it's sort of, it's not as flexible a weapon system as some of the others. And you are like with this, you know, there is risk of your sword getting caught on your carbine, which I suspect why like you don't really hear about the carbine being used as a pairing device with swords. I think I've actually heard of it. Like most of the accounts of a carbine being used as a pairing device or even like a musket is in North America with sort of like ranger and frontiersman units where they have something in their offhand to parry, which is why, you know, and then they have usually a tomahawk coming in as their weapon. And, you know, they've probably got the idea from, you know, the idea is you have something to parry with, like a dedicated parrying tool and a dedicated offense tool, primarily because, you know, if you don't have like a sword with a nice hilt, you kind of need to dedicate, like if you've got like a knife or an axe, it's very, very hard to fight with a knife or an axe in a way that lets you parry and attack equally well. When you're doing, you know, if you watched a video on Bowie knife from a few weeks ago, probably actually 2 months at this point, you know, it's like parrying with a knife happens very, very rarely. And, you know, that is a product of the guard as much as anything else. And also the fact that to parry with the knife, as we would have seen earlier, can be a very, very committed movement. You have to be quite careful. You know, conversely with this, or, you know, with this same idea, it's this big committed dedicated parrying tool, and you've got a dedicated attacking tool on the other hand, which would normally be an axe. All right, so I'm just gonna pause for questions or come back for questions if you want to ask any. And yeah, then we'll go from there. So are there any questions? So yeah, I always find it interesting when we're doing sort of historical extrapolation stuff, because I noticed with Viking stuff that a lot of things that were essentially educated guesses. You can go, oh, well, later weapons work like this, and this makes biomechanics sense. So therefore, the weapon might have been used like this might be, or people coming up with systems based on those extrapolations that are then quoted as authentic. And yeah, it's like, they're not necessarily like documented systems. They're what people kind of estimate because we don't have sources. And with this, we know that, like, you know, the sort of stuff we're doing tonight was, I mean, there's examples of it happening, certainly with like a lot of the offhand weapons, but it was, you know, it was fairly obscure. It was much more fringe than compared to sort of the mainstream sort of single sword, you know, saber, you know, just using a saber, just using a cutlass, just using a small sword kind of methods. All right, so I'm going to assume there weren't any questions, and I'm just going to pause. Oh, we've got a question. So Dylan points out, from what I've seen, a lot of carbines from 1880 to 1920 were issued with bayonets. Yeah, that is true. There's actually, I think there's, in some cases, the bayonets were also a lot longer. I know with the 95th, which were a skirmish unit with rifles, which were shorter than muskets. Like they had this model of rifle that was shorter. They were given sword bayonets because it was thought that having a sword bayonet would make up for the lack of reach that the rifle had over a musket. But yeah, like even then, like a lot of it's not uncommon to hear about units armed with carbines preferring a sword or preferring like some other kind of weapon to coming in with what is essentially a shorter bayonet. So I mean, it was one of the tricks of the Gurkhas, I believe, and one of the things that kind of was that they come in with their musket or a carbine in the offhand and coming just with a kukari and or a kukri. I don't know how to pronounce that. And come in, but yeah, like they did. There was also an expectation. There was also instances of carbines having bayonets, which. So yeah, it's kind of a bit of both. So Patrick S points out, rifles with sword bayonets were almost the same length as a brown vest with a bayonet. Yeah, yeah, which is true. Yeah, that's. Although interestingly, like actually a couple of years ago, I had a chance to handle one of the sword bayonets. I was hanging out with some polyonic reenactors, and like they're quite happy for me to just kind of have a look at their gear. The thing about reenactors, they're usually quite happy if they know that you're safe. They're quite happy to show off their gear because that's kind of half the fun. And I was playing with one of the sword bayonets. I'm sort of sitting there, and then I got to like just hold it attached to rifle on leg, and I'm like, wow, I would so much prefer to use this as a sword than as a bayonet. Which yeah, but no, it's I guess there was kind of an expectation that you might be in you might be in a bayonet charge. Like bayonet charges are still really important to warfare in the 19th century. And what's really interesting is you get further and further into the 19th century where firearms technology is improving, and also often British tactics were relying more and more on firearms because they had just superior firepower to their enemies, to like the people they were facing. And they're sort of talking about phasing out bayonets and swords, and then there'll be some instance, where the British are defeated because the enemy managed to get close, and firearms technology wasn't really at the point where it was still like you could easily reliably reload, or carry enough ammunition that you could use. That you could use like a firearm as a melee weapon. So sort of, there's kind of this interesting thing where the British were quite convinced that swords and bayonets would fall out of use in the late 1800s, and then kind of kept regretting that right up until about World War One, and then after World War One. After World War One, you get people like General Haig saying that he thought that cavalry would continue to play an important role on the battlefield, which is kind of after World War One with the rise of tanks. Cool. So, any other comments, questions, things of that nature? I don't know. I don't have anything quippy. Quips? Do you have quips? I'm gonna take that as a no, and we're going to pause recording.